The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It came down from the mountains like a hungry animal, carrying a storm that was meant to kill. Margaret Sullivan felt its teeth through her worn gloves, her knuckles bone white as she fought the wagon through the snow. Every turn of the wheel was a war against the endless, blinding white. Beside her, a small voice trembled, nearly stolen by the gale. "Mama, are we almost there?" Samuel, her son. He was only 7, too young for the truth, but old enough to feel the cold hand of his mother's fear. She pulled him closer, the rough wool of her shawl a poor defense against the cold. "Just a little farther, sweetheart," she lied. The words were ash in her mouth. They weren't just lost, they were swallowed. The main road was a memory, and Cheyenne was a prayer that was already freezing on her lips. The snow was a curtain now, falling so fast and thick that the world had simply vanished. Their horse, a strong bay she'd paid too much for, was starting to panic. Its snorts were puffs of pure terror. "She's scared, Mama," Samuel whispered, his face buried in her side. "She'll be fine," Margaret said, forcing a strength she didn't feel into her voice. "Horses are made for snow." The lie barely had time to die before the first howl sliced through the storm. It was long, and it was close. So very close. The horse's ears went flat. Its pace quickened, no longer from Margaret's urging, but from pure animal terror. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Wolves. Another howl answered the first, this one from the left, then another from behind. They were being herded. The horse screamed in terror, breaking into a frantic, bucking gallop that threw the wagon from side to side. "Hold tight, Samuel!" Margaret yelled, wrapping an arm around him, fighting the reins with the other. Through the chaos of swirling snow, she saw them, gray shadows moving with a liquid grace, their eyes glowing like embers in the dying light. They were keeping pace, flanking them, waiting. One of them, bigger and bolder than the rest, darted in. It lunged for the horse's legs. The horse screamed again, a sound so human, so filled with agony, that it would haunt Margaret's dreams for the rest of her life. The wagon lurched violently, veering hard to the right. The left wheel lifted, spinning uselessly in the air. Time slowed down. They were tipping, sliding, and that's when she saw it. A ravine. A steep, dark gash in the white landscape that hadn't been there a second ago. A place to fall forever. "Mama!" Samuel shrieked, his little fingers digging into her arm like claws. She dropped the reins. There was no controlling it now. She wrapped both arms around her son, a human shield, ready to throw them clear if the wagon went over. The horse reared, its hooves pawing at the gray shapes that now circled closer, closer. Then the world exploded. A crack split the air, sharper than the wind, louder than the wolves. Then another. Two of the gray shapes crumpled, their bodies staining the snow with dark, spreading circles of red. The rest scattered, melting back into the storm as if they were never there. The horse, still wild with fear, reared one last time. The wagon tipped further, balancing on the very edge of nothing. Margaret felt herself sliding, clutching Samuel to her chest. And then a hand shot out of the storm, a strong hand that grabbed her arm. "Jump!" a voice commanded. "Now!" There was no time to think. She pushed Samuel toward the hand, felt him being lifted away from her, into safety. Then the same strong hands were on her, pulling her from the tipping wagon just as it finally gave up its fight. With a sickening splinter of wood, the wagon, their home, everything they owned, plunged into the ravine and disappeared. Margaret landed hard, the air driven from her lungs in a painful rush. For a moment she just lay there, the snow cold against her cheek, the world a silent, white blur. When she could finally breathe again, she rolled over and looked up. A tall figure stood over her, a rifle in one hand. In the crook of his other arm, he held Samuel, safe and sound. The man set her son down gently. Then he turned to her. Snow clung to his hat and broad shoulders, hiding his face in shadow, but she could see a square jaw covered in stubble and eyes the color of a winter sky. "Can you stand, ma'am?" His voice was quieter now, but it still held that same steel command. She nodded, not sure if her legs would obey. He offered a hand, large, calloused, steady. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. Samuel, she choked out. I'm here, Mama. He was beside her in an instant, his small body trembling against her side. The stranger looked toward the ravine, his expression grim. Nothing to salvage down there, he said. Horse is gone, too. The words hit her like a physical blow. Despair, cold and bitter, rose in her throat. Their clothes, their food, the little money she had, gone. Everything was gone. We need shelter, the man said, his gaze turning to the darkening sky. Storm's getting worse. My place is about a mile north. He paused, his winter eyes studying her face. Unless you've got somewhere else to go. She had nowhere. They were adrift in a frozen hell. But following a stranger, a man with a rifle and cold eyes, was a different kind of danger altogether. She tightened her arm around Samuel's small shoulders. I don't mean you harm, the man said, as if he could read the fear warring in her mind. But that boy won't last another hour out here. Neither will you. A vicious gust of wind ripped through them, proving his point. Samuel shivered violently, his lips already tinged with blue. She had to make a choice. What's your name? She asked, her voice a thin thread against the wind. Nathaniel Thorne. He shifted the rifle, extending his right hand. It was a formal, old-fashioned gesture that felt strangely reassuring in the middle of the wilderness. Former captain, Union Army. She took his hand. It was rough but warm. Margaret Sullivan, this is my son, Samuel. Nathaniel nodded, then knelt to Samuel's level. Think you can walk a mile, son? Samuel looked from his mother to the stranger, then gave a single solemn nod. Good man. Nathaniel stood, gesturing north into the white void. Stay close. Easy to get lost. They walked for what felt like an eternity, Nathaniel breaking a path through the deepening snow. When Samuel started to stumble, his small legs no match for the drifts, Nathaniel lifted him onto his broad shoulders without a word and kept going, his pace never slowing. Just when Margaret thought she couldn't take another step, a shape emerged from the swirling snow. A log cabin, sturdy and strong, with smoke curling from a stone chimney like a promise of life. Home, Nathaniel said, lowering Samuel to the ground. Inside, a fire crackled in a great stone hearth. The warmth was a physical shock, so intense it was almost painful. The cabin was one large room, simple but clean, with a table, a few chairs, and a rocking chair facing the fire. Nathaniel went straight to the hearth, adding another log. Get warm, he said, his back to them. I'll make something hot to drink. Margaret guided Samuel to the fire, peeling off his wet coat and boots. His little feet were a terrifying waxy white. She rubbed them between her own frozen hands, trying to bring the life back into them. Nathaniel moved with a quiet efficiency, putting a kettle on to boil. There was a competence about him that was both calming and intimidating. You live here alone? Margaret asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded without turning. Just me. For how long? 5 years this winter. He brought over 2 steaming mugs. Careful, it's hot. It wasn't coffee or tea. It was hot chocolate, rich and sweet. Samuel's eyes went wide at the first sip. It was a small act of kindness, but it felt monumental. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. Nathaniel just nodded, settling into the rocking chair with his own mug. No one should be out in weather like this, he said, his eyes studying them over the rim of his cup. Especially not a woman and child. It wasn't just a statement, it was a question she wasn't ready to answer. She sipped her chocolate, letting the warmth spread through her, a temporary shield against the questions in his eyes. He seemed to accept her silence, turning his attention to Samuel. How are those feet feeling, son? Better, sir, Samuel mumbled, wiggling his toes near the fire. Good. Frostbite's no joke. Nathaniel got up and pulled a pair of thick woolen socks from a wooden trunk. These'll be too big, but they're warm. He helped Samuel pull them on. They came nearly to the boy's knees, making him look small and fragile. Then, as if reading her mind, he asked, Hungry? Samuel's stomach answered for him with a loud, embarrassing growl. The boy flushed red, but the corner of Nathaniel's mouth twitched. I'll take that as a yes. He began preparing food, a thick stew that had clearly been simmering for hours. The simple domestic act felt so at odds with the hard, quiet man. He moved like a soldier, efficient and precise, yet he cooked like someone who had once cared for a family. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the scream of the wind outside. Samuel was so tired he was swaying in his chair, his eyes closing between bites. "You two can take the bedroom," Nathaniel said, nodding toward a door she hadn't noticed. "I'll sleep out here." "We couldn't," she started to protest. "You can," he cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The boy needs a proper bed." The bedroom was as neat as the main room, dominated by a large bed covered with a handmade quilt. On a small dresser sat a single photograph in a wooden frame, but it was turned away from the door. She helped Samuel into the bed, and he was asleep before his head hit the pillow. She stood over him for a long moment, her heart a painful knot of love and fear. They had lost everything, but they were alive. She went back out to the main room. Nathaniel was banking the fire for the night. "There are extra blankets in that chest," he said without looking up. "Mr. Thorne," she began, needing to thank him again, needing to say something. "Nathaniel," he corrected, finally turning to face her. His face was half in shadow, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest, Mrs. Sullivan." "Margaret," she corrected him back, "and I will. I promise we'll be out of your way as soon as the storm breaks." He just nodded. "Storm like this might last for days," was all he said. Back in the bedroom, she slipped under the quilt next to her son, still fully clothed. Sleep should have come easily, but her mind wouldn't stop. The wolves, the ravine, the stranger, Nathaniel Thorne. Was he their savior, or just a different kind of danger she hadn't yet learned to recognize? She must have drifted off because the words were spilling from her lips before she was even aware of them, dredged up from the deepest, most terrified part of her mind. "Cheyenne Bank. Not there. Robert, please." A floorboard creaked outside the door. Her eyes snapped open, her heart leaping into her throat. Through the crack in the door, she saw him. Nathaniel. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted, listening. Had he heard her? Did he understand? She lay frozen, barely daring to breathe. After a long, silent moment, he moved away, and she heard him settle onto a cot near the fire. She didn't sleep again for a long time. She just lay there in the dark, listening to the storm, wondering if she had just traded one prison for another. Nathaniel was awake before the first hint of dawn. It was a habit from the war, a habit he'd never been able to break. He lay on his cot listening. The wind had eased, but the silence told him the snow was still falling, heavy and wet. His left shoulder ached, an old friend reminding him of the coming weather. He rose without a sound and coaxed the fire back to life. In the flickering light, his gaze fell on the bedroom door, still slightly ajar. He could hear the soft, even breathing of the boy. The woman, Margaret, was another story. He'd heard her tossing and turning. He'd heard her whisper in her sleep. Cheyenne Bank. Robert. The words had hung in the quiet cabin like a death sentence. He'd spent years as a Pinkerton detective. He knew the scent of a person on the run. And Margaret Sullivan was running from something far worse than a blizzard. He started making coffee, the familiar routine a comfort against the ghosts the night had stirred. He'd built this cabin to be alone, to forget the world and the things he'd done in it. Now the world had crashed right through his door. The door creaked open, and she was standing there. She looked exhausted, her face pale, dark circles like bruises under her eyes. But she held herself with a kind of brittle dignity, her chin up, as if daring him to judge her. "Good morning," she said, her voice quiet. He just nodded toward the stove. "Coffee's on." She moved closer to the fire, rubbing her arms. "Still snowing." "Winds died down, though," he said, pouring 2 cups. "Could last another day. Could last 3." He handed her a mug. He wanted to ask. He wanted to know who Robert was, what happened at the Cheyenne Bank. But years of interrogation had taught him that the best way to get information was to wait for it. People couldn't stand the silence. They always filled it with the truth eventually. "I want to thank you again," she said, her voice tight. "You saved our lives." Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said, and her certainty was absolute. "They wouldn't have." He turned back to the stove, uncomfortable. Gratitude was a currency he no longer traded in. "Your boy's still sleeping." Yes, he was exhausted. He's a brave kid, Nathaniel said, remembering the boy's solemn nod in the middle of the storm. Didn't cry once. A softness came into her eyes. He's had to be. There it was again, a door opening just a crack, offering a glimpse into a life of hardship. He decided to push, just a little. Your accent, he observed. Eastern. Pennsylvania, she answered, cautious. Long way from home. Yes, was all she said. The door slammed shut again. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Samuel emerged, sleepy and shy, his hair sticking up in every direction. He ate the biscuits and bacon with a quiet reverence, his eyes wide. The boy had manners, Nathaniel noted. He also had his mother's watchful eyes. Have you always lived alone? Samuel asked suddenly, the question hanging in the air. Margaret shot him a warning look, but Nathaniel waved it off. No, son, he said, his voice softer than he intended. Not always. He didn't offer more, and they didn't ask. After the meal, Margaret insisted on cleaning up. It's the least I can do, she said, her tone firm. He let her. He understood her need to feel useful, to pretend for a moment that this wasn't a desperate situation, that she wasn't a prisoner of the storm in a stranger's home. While she washed, he went to check on the animals. Outside, the world was a soft, silent landscape of white. The snow was easily 2 feet deep and still falling. In the barn, his horses greeted him with soft nickers. Got company, he told them, forking hay into their mangers. Don't get used to it. When he returned to the cabin, Samuel was standing by the fireplace holding a small wooden horse Nathaniel had carved one long winter night. Did you make this? The boy asked, his voice filled with awe. Nathaniel just nodded. It's really good, Samuel said, running a small finger over the smooth lines of the carving. Can you teach me? Before Margaret could intervene, Nathaniel heard himself say, Sure, got plenty of wood, plenty of time. The boy's face lit up with a pure, uncomplicated joy that was almost painful to see. It was the face of a child who hadn't had much to be joyful about. The day passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The storm raged outside, locking them in. He showed Samuel how to hold the knife, how to shave off small curls of wood, how to find the shape hiding inside the block. Margaret sat nearby, mending a tear in Samuel's coat, her needle moving with a steady rhythm. But he could feel her watching them. He could feel her wrestling with her fear, with her secrets. As dusk fell, they ate venison stew by the firelight. The conversation was sparse, careful. He learned her father was a minister. He learned she had lost a brother at Gettysburg. The name of the battle fell between them like a stone. Were you there? She asked, her voice low. He felt the old wound in his shoulder ache. Yes, he said, and the single word was a wall. He didn't want to talk about the war. He didn't want to remember the man he used to be. After dinner, he pulled his old, battered Bible from a shelf. It was a habit, a ritual. He offered it to her. Thought you might want something to read. She took it with a reverence that surprised him, her fingers tracing the worn leather. Samuel curled up beside her as she began to read aloud, her voice a soft, steady murmur against the storm. She read the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Her voice broke on the words. A single tear traced a path down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. He looked away, feeling like an intruder on a private grief. What valley had she walked through? What evil had she feared? The question hung in the air, unanswered, and he realized he was no longer just curious. He needed to know. The storm broke on the third morning. The world outside the cabin was a sea of pristine, untouched white under a sky of piercing blue. The beauty of it was sharp, almost violent. It's past, Nathaniel said, handing Margaret a cup of coffee. The fragile peace of their confinement was over. She took the cup, her knuckles white. Do you think we could get to town? The urgency was back in her voice, sharp as a shard of ice. Her eyes kept darting to the window, as if she expected to see someone coming for her. On horseback, maybe, he said slowly, watching her. The road won't be clear for days. Relief and panic fought for control of her face. Would you take us? She asked, the words tumbling out. I can pay you, once we get to town. He knew he should say yes. He should take them to town and be done with it. Let them be someone else's problem. But the words she'd whispered in her sleep echoed in his mind. Cheyenne Bank. Robert. We can try, he said finally. Tomorrow morning, if the weather holds. The gratitude in her eyes made him uncomfortable. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who was tired of running from his own ghosts. Maybe helping her run from hers would be a kind of penance. Later that morning, he took Samuel out to check a rabbit snare he'd set. The boy was thrilled, his laughter echoing in the cold, clear air. As they walked back, Margaret fell into step beside him. "Thank you for being so kind to him," she said, her voice low. "He hasn't had many good men in his life." The words were a stone dropped into a deep well. He could only guess at the darkness at the bottom. "He's a good boy," was all he could manage. "He has a good mother." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I've tried," she whispered. "It hasn't been easy." Back at the cabin, as he showed Samuel how to skin the rabbit, he felt her eyes on him again. There was a fragile hope in her expression that scared him more than any storm. He found himself imagining it, what it would be like if they stayed. If the silence of his life was filled with a boy's laughter and a woman's quiet strength. The thought was a betrayal of the wife and child he had lost. He pushed it away, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. They would leave in the morning. That was the plan. It was the only plan. Later that afternoon, as he was showing Samuel how to carve a bird from a piece of pine, Margaret suddenly put down her mending. "Nathaniel," she said, and her voice was different. The fear was gone, replaced by a hard resolve. "There's something you need to know." She sent Samuel to the other side of the room, then sat across from him at the table, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "We're not just lost travelers," she began. "I'm running from my husband, Robert Sullivan." The name hit him like a bullet. He kept his face a mask of stone, but inside his world shifted. Robert Sullivan, the ringleader of the gang that had robbed the Cheyenne Bank. The man who had killed 3 people in cold blood. The man Nathaniel had hunted for 6 months before the trail went cold, and he had finally given up, quitting the Pinkertons and disappearing into this wilderness. "He's a dangerous man," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He's looking for us. He'll never stop." "Why?" he asked, his own voice sounding distant. "Because you left him?" She hesitated, her eyes filled with a pain that was terrible to see. "Because I took something," she whispered. "Something he values more than his own son." "Money," he guessed, though he already knew. She nodded. "From the bank job in Cheyenne." So, it was true. This woman, this quiet, frightened mother, was tangled up with one of the most ruthless outlaws in the territory. He should have felt anger, betrayal. He had brought a criminal into his home. But all he felt was a cold, sinking dread. For her. For the boy. "I didn't know," she said, as if sensing his thoughts. "Not until after, when I saw the blood on his clothes. The money hidden in the cellar. I had to get Samuel away." She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze fierce. "You have to believe me." He looked over at Samuel, so engrossed in his carving, so innocent, and he made a choice. "I believe you," he said, and it was the truth. But her story wasn't finished. He could see it in her eyes. There was another secret, something even bigger than the money. "That's not all I took," she said, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear her. "There was something else hidden with the money. A book." "A book?" "A ledger," she corrected. "His ledger. It has everything. Every robbery, every bribe, every name, including the names of 3 sheriffs who were on his payroll." The air in the cabin suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. This wasn't just about a bank robbery anymore. It was a conspiracy. A woman on the run didn't just have stolen money, she had a weapon. A weapon that could bring down Robert Sullivan's entire empire. A weapon that he would kill anyone to get back. And she had brought it right here, to his door. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a victim, but a woman of incredible courage. She had defied a monster and stolen his most precious secret. The risks she had taken were staggering. "Where is this ledger?" he asked, his voice tight. She reached under the collar of her dress and pulled out a small key on a leather cord. "Hidden," she said. "He knows you have it? He knows it's missing, He'll assume I took it. That changed everything. Sullivan wasn't just hunting his wife to punish her. He was hunting her to silence her. Permanently. We leave for town at first light, he said, his decision absolute. There's a sheriff in Clearwater, Jim Monroe. He's one of the few men I'd trust with my life. If that ledger is what you say it is, he can help. For the first time since she'd arrived, a flicker of genuine hope lit up her eyes. You'll still help us? Even knowing this? He looked at Samuel, who had finished his carving and was now holding up a rough-hewn bird with a proud grin. The boy deserved a chance. They both did. I'll still help you, he said. What he didn't tell her was that this was no longer just about helping a woman and her son. This was personal. Robert Sullivan was the ghost he'd come to these mountains to escape. The one failure that had haunted him, that had driven him from his life's work. Now that ghost had followed him home, and Nathaniel Thorne wasn't going to run from it again. That night after Samuel was asleep, the truth finally came out. All of it. Samuel hadn't just been shielded from his father's darkness. He had been living in its shadow, a silent witness. I heard him, the boy confessed, his voice small but steady after he'd woken from a nightmare. The night we left, he was talking about the bank, about the guard who got hurt. Margaret looked stricken. She had tried so hard to protect him, but the evil had seeped through the cracks. I know Papa hits you, Samuel continued, his old man eyes looking at his mother. I know you took the money from his box. He had seen everything. He had carried that terrible knowledge all by himself, trying to protect his mother in the only way he knew how. Later, when the boy was finally asleep again, Margaret looked at Nathaniel, her eyes filled with a terrible raw guilt. I thought I was protecting him, she whispered. You were, he said, his voice rough. And so was he. He realized then that he was no longer an outsider to their story. He was a part of it. When she finally went to bed, he stood by the fire for a long time, the weight of his promise settling over him. He wasn't just taking them to town. He was walking back into a war he thought he had left behind. The journey to Clearwater was a tightrope walk over a canyon of fear. Every snap of a twig, every shadow in the trees, felt like a threat. Nathaniel led the way on foot, his rifle in his hand, while Margaret and Samuel rode his steady old horse, Thunder. The world was beautiful, a fresh canvas of white and blue, but the beauty was a lie. Danger was hiding just beneath the surface. They spoke little, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken fears. Halfway there, they stopped to rest by a frozen creek. Nathaniel built a small fire. As the flames licked at the dry wood, Margaret asked him about Sheriff Monroe. He's a good man, Nathaniel said, honest, and he has no love for men like your husband. Will he believe me? She asked, her voice small. About the money? About the ledger? He'll believe you, Nathaniel said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. He knew the law. He knew how it could twist things. A woman who admitted to taking stolen money was a thief, no matter her reasons. But Jim Monroe was different. He had to be. As they were getting ready to leave, Samuel came running from the trees, his face flushed with excitement. He'd found wolf tracks, big ones, right where they had stopped. Margaret went pale. The memory of the attack was still too fresh, too raw. They're old tracks, Nathaniel reassured her, though his own senses were suddenly on high alert. Long gone. But he knew wolves weren't the only predators that hunted in these mountains. As they got closer to town, the tension became almost unbearable. Then as they crested a small hill, Clearwater appeared below them, a handful of buildings huddled in a valley, smoke rising from the chimneys. It looked peaceful, safe. But as they drew nearer, Nathaniel stopped dead. At the far end of the main street, tied outside the saloon, were 3 horses. One of them, a big roan with a distinctive white blaze on its face, made his blood run cold. He'd seen that horse before, on a wanted poster. It belonged to James Delaney, Robert Sullivan's right-hand man. They weren't just being followed. They had been beaten. Sullivan's men were already here, waiting. What is it? Margaret whispered, sensing his alarm. Trouble, he said, his voice grim. We're not going in the main way. He led them down a side trail, circling around the edge of town, his eyes scanning every alley, every window. The peaceful little town now felt like a trap, its quiet streets filled with invisible threats. They were almost to the sheriff's office when a group of ranchers rode past. "Evening, Thorne," one of them called out. "Bringing company to town?" The man's friendly greeting felt like a death knell. In a town this small, news traveled faster than a telegraph. By now, every man in that saloon knew a stranger was in town with Nathaniel Thorne. Time had just run out. He hustled them inside the sheriff's office. Behind the desk sat a broad-shouldered man with a weary but honest face. James Monroe. "Nate," the sheriff said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What in God's name brings you here?" "Trouble, Jim," Nathaniel said, closing the door behind him. "Big trouble." He sent Samuel out to the main office with the promise of cookies from a deputy's desk. Then, in the quiet of the sheriff's private office, the story came pouring out. Margaret, her voice shaking but firm, told him everything. About Robert, about the abuse, about the robbery, and finally about the ledger. Nathaniel placed the small, leather-bound book on the sheriff's desk. Monroe opened it. As he read, his face grew darker and darker. "My God," he whispered, looking up at them. This is bigger than I ever imagined." He recognized the names, the crooked lawmen, the powerful men who had been protecting Sullivan for years. "This ledger is a death warrant," Monroe said, his eyes grave. "For him, and for anyone who knows about it." Just then, the office door opened. A young deputy stood there, his face pale. "Sheriff," he said, his voice urgent, "those men down at the saloon. I just got word. They rode out of town a few minutes ago. Headed east." East. Toward the main road. Toward Cheyenne. Margaret's face drained of all color. "They're going to get Robert," she whispered. The trap hadn't been waiting for them in town. The trap was the town itself. Delaney and Holt hadn't been there to catch them. They'd been there to confirm they had arrived. And now they were on their way to bring the devil himself down upon them. "You can't stay here," Monroe said, his mind already working. "The hotel isn't safe. Nowhere in this town is safe." He looked from Margaret's terrified face to Nathaniel's grim one. "There's only one place you might have a chance, a place he won't expect you to go." Nathaniel knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "You have to go back to your cabin." It was a desperate plan, but it was their only one. Sullivan would expect them to keep running, to head for a bigger city, to try and disappear. He would never expect them to turn around and run back into the empty wilderness, back to the one place he might think they'd already left. They spent a tense night at the sheriff's house on the edge of town, every sound from the street making them jump. At first light, they were on their way, Monroe riding with them for the first few miles. "I'll telegraph the U.S. Marshals in Cheyenne," the sheriff promised before he left them. "But it could take them a week, maybe more, to get here with this snow. Until then, you're on your own. Godspeed, Nate." The ride back was a blur of adrenaline and fear. The beautiful, silent landscape now seemed menacing, every tree a potential hiding place for an ambush. They pushed the horses hard, knowing that every minute counted. When they finally saw the cabin, smoke still curling faintly from the chimney, it looked like the safest place on earth. But Nathaniel knew it was a cage. A sturdy, defensible cage. But a cage nonetheless. "Wait here," he said, drawing his revolver as he dismounted. He circled the cabin, his senses on high alert, checking for any sign that they had been followed. The snow was undisturbed. They were safe for now. He gave Margaret the all clear, and they hurried inside, the warmth of the fire a small comfort against the chilling fear. For a few hours, a fragile sense of normalcy returned. Margaret made a simple meal. Samuel, exhausted but resilient, drew pictures by the fire. He drew the cabin, and under it, he wrote the word home. The sight of it was a knife in Nathaniel's gut. This place, this sanctuary he had built to escape the world, was about to become a battlefield. As dusk began to settle, he was cleaning his rifle when he saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the trees. Not an animal. It was a man watching them. "They're here," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Margaret's face went white. She hurried Samuel into the bedroom, her movements calm and steady, betraying none of the terror she must have felt. Nathaniel moved through the cabin, securing the windows, barring the door. He was a soldier again, preparing his defenses. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The sun went down, and the world outside was plunged into a dark, cold abyss. They waited. Then a voice called out from the darkness, smooth and confident. "Margaret, I know you're in there, my love. It's time to come home." It was Robert Sullivan. The voice was everything Margaret had described, charming on the surface, with a venomous current running just beneath. "I'm not looking for a fight," Sullivan called out, his tone reasonable, almost friendly. "Just give me what you took, and we can all walk away from this. You, the boy, and your new friend." "He's lying," Margaret whispered from beside Nathaniel. She was holding one of his revolvers, her hand surprisingly steady. "He'll kill us all." "I know," Nathaniel said, his eyes scanning the darkness. He could make out three shapes now, spreading out, surrounding the cabin. "He's giving us until dawn," Sullivan's voice echoed through the night. "Make your choice." Dawn. It was an executioner's deadline. They had a few hours of darkness, a few hours to wait for the inevitable. But Nathaniel Thorne was done waiting. He had spent years waiting for peace, and it had never come. Now he would make his own. "They'll expect us to wait," he said to Margaret, his voice low and intense. "They'll expect us to be afraid. They won't expect us to fight back." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the hunt is over," he said, checking his revolver. "I'm going out there." "Nate, no! There are three of them." "This is my home," he said, and the words held a weight she had never heard before. "These are my woods. Out there in the dark, I have the advantage." He explained the plan quickly. He would slip out the back. She was to make noise, move furniture, make Sullivan's men think they were fortifying the cabin, that there were more people inside than just one man, a woman, and a child. "If you hear shooting," he said, his hand on the back window latch, "be ready." She grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "Come back," she whispered. "Promise me." He looked at her, at this woman who had crashed into his life and awakened a part of him he thought was long dead. He looked through the bedroom door at Samuel, huddled under the blankets, pretending to be asleep but listening to every word. "I promise," he said. And then he was gone, a shadow melting into the shadows, leaving her alone with her son and a gun, the only thing standing between them and the monster outside. He moved through the snow-choked forest like a ghost. He was back in the war, every sense screaming, every nerve taut. He found their camp easily, a small shielded fire casting flickering shadows on the faces of three men. He recognized Sullivan immediately, his handsome face twisted into an arrogant smirk as he talked with his men. Nathaniel waited, patient as a wolf, for his moment. It came when Sullivan, confident and careless, decided to walk the perimeter alone. Nathaniel let him pass, then stepped out of the darkness, the muzzle of his revolver pressed against Sullivan's spine. "It's over," he said. The fight went out of Sullivan in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Nathaniel tied him to a tree deep in the woods where his men wouldn't find him. "My men will kill you," Sullivan hissed, his voice a snake's whisper. "They'll take the ledger, and they'll burn that cabin to the ground with your woman and that boy inside." "The ledger is already with the sheriff," Nathaniel lied, his voice flat and cold. "And they're not my woman and boy, but I'm going to make sure they're safe from you. Permanently." He left Sullivan there and circled back. Two men left. He separated them with a trick as old as the hills, a snapped twig in the darkness. The one called Delaney came to investigate, walking right into Nathaniel's trap. The man was jumpy, desperate. He went for his rifle. Nathaniel's shot was a single, deafening crack that echoed through the silent woods. Delaney went down, clutching a shattered shoulder. As he was tying the man up, he heard it. A gunshot from the cabin. Then another. And a man's scream, cut short. He ran, his heart hammering in his chest, expecting the worst. He burst into the clearing to a scene from a nightmare. The third man, Holt, lay dead in the snow in front of the open cabin door. And in the doorway, framed by the firelight, stood Margaret. The smoking revolver was still in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, protective fire he had never seen before. She had done it. She had saved herself. She had saved her son. Just then, the sound of hoofbeats thundered through the trees. Sheriff Monroe and a posse of deputies burst into the clearing, their guns drawn. They had followed Sullivan's trail, arriving at the last possible second. It was over. Truly over. The sun rose on a new world. The cabin was quiet, filled with the soft morning light. Sheriff Monroe and his men were gone, taking with them the last vestiges of Robert Sullivan's evil. Sullivan was on his way to a federal prison, and from there, to the gallows. The ledger had done its work. Samuel was asleep on the cot by the fire, a peaceful smile on his face for the first time since Nathaniel had met him. Margaret sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. She looked tired, but she looked free. He sat down across from her. The silence between them was no longer filled with fear, but with an unspoken question. "The marshals will come," he said quietly. "They'll want you to testify. Then they'll offer you a new life, a new name." She looked up, and her eyes were clear and steady. "I've had enough of running," she said. "I've had enough of new names and new towns. I think, I think we found a place to stop." Samuel stirred on his cot. He sat up, saw them sitting together, and a slow, sleepy grin spread across his face. "Are we staying?" he asked, his voice full of a child's simple, hopeful logic. Nathaniel looked at Margaret. He saw the future in her eyes, a future he never thought he would have again, a future filled with warmth and laughter and love, a future that had been forged in the heart of a storm. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Yes, son," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in a lifetime. "We're staying." This cabin had been a shelter from the world for a long time. Now it was finally a home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances, and you want to hear more tales from the edge of the world, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what you think. Could you have been as brave as Margaret? We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.